Let's see. I have some sharing to do about some meditations that I've been doing the past few months. I've been a bad girl at the Abbey. I have kept an Sravasti Abbey resident library book out of the library for 5 months. And it has been a real life preserver for me. It's Jeffrey Hopkins' A Truthful Heart, Buddhist Practices for Connecting with Others. The book is filled with wonderful tools. I've done a few BBCs over the past few months. Some beautiful tools to work with our resistance, at least personally. I feel like a resistance and at times in my mind an inability to generate compassion. And over again, what's so beautiful about the book as he leads us through these step-by-step meditations on developing a mind ready to generate compassion, he says, this is going to take a lot of time. Turning the mind that is obsessed with the self is no small task. And so what he does is he takes such care with taking us step by step through the meditations, using personal stories of his own experience on how he used these meditations to transform his mind and to really start widening the view of his mind. The book is slowly getting me to have some bigger perspective because I have really struggled this past year about what's going on in this country. I can have some compassion in my mind, I can have some understanding, and then something happens and I get appalled, I get confounded, I get astounded, and then I lose it. And I found it really difficult time to sustain any form of compassion. Or the heartbreaking tragedies that are unfolding throughout the world with all of the catastrophic natural disasters and the violence happening around the world. I've chosen to reduce my news watching, which has helped a lot, but because we do meditations with the public and with our lay friends, I've got to keep somewhat of a track of that, but I've reduced it a lot, which has helped also to keep my mind somewhat balanced and somewhat open to things. So by the time I've gotten to chapter 13 now, which is almost toward the end of the book, and Jeffrey goes right to the heart of the matter of what compassion is. It is the seed, the cause for Buddhahood. Wisdom also is required for Buddhahood, but this unshakable great compassion that not only wishes for all beings to be free of suffering and its causes, but when it really comes to deeply understand the level of dukkha that all sentient beings, without exception, experience, as well as the incredible kindness that one has received since beginning this time from these sentient beings. This great compassion commits those who have it in their minds to vow to free all sentient beings without exception, and I will do it alone if I have to. So there's this kind of incredible mind that we're trying to generate, but the process of getting the mind to even think about that takes some doing. So when we get to chapter 13, Jeffrey refers to the beautiful verses by Chandrakirti, which we have, the homage to great compassion, which I want to recite because I have been using these verses, these lines for the past 2 months, trying to keep my mind in some kind of compassionate state for at least some of the day. So this is the version that we have downstairs in the foyer. Jeffrey's got some excerpts of it that have slightly different translations, but pretty much the same thinking. Praise to great compassion. Hearers in solitary realize arise from Buddhas. Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. The compassionate mind and the non-dual awareness, as well as bodhicitta, these are the causes of bodhisattvas. Compassion alone is seen as the seed of a victor's rich harvest, as water that nourishes it, and as the ripened fruit that is the source of long enjoyment. Therefore, at the start, I praise compassion. Like a water wheel in motion, migrators have no autonomy. First, with the thought I, they cling to a self. Then, with the thought mine, they become attached to things. I bow to this compassion that cares for migrators. Homage to that compassion for migrators, seen as evanescent and empty of inherent existence, like the reflection of the moon in rippling water. So these verses have lots to them. Venerable has done retreats on these verses. But what I've been focusing on is the three kinds of compassion, which are and Venerable has one translation, and Jeffrey has one very similar, but I wanted to put them side by side. The first one is compassion observing sentient beings. That was Venerable's. Jeffrey's is compassion seeing suffering beings. The second compassion is compassion observing phenomena, or compassion seeing evanescent beings. That's the second. And the third one is compassion observing the unapprehendable or objectless. And Jeffrey says compassion seeing empty beings. So for the past 2 months, I've been really trying to work with the first one, is to see compassion observing sentient beings as caught in dukkha. And before we can extend this deep wish to all beings, even our dear Mr. Trump, or the white supremacists, or the fake news hosts, to be free of suffering and its causes, we have to look directly at the dire situation that we're in. So right off the bat, we start with ourselves. We have to see how trapped we are in this cycle of life, overwhelmed by afflictions and karma, stemming from the self-grasping ignorance, this erroneous way of looking at how we exist and how we think things exist. Venerable Damtra really addressed that this morning in her meditation, how this is the source of all of our misery, this self-grasping ignorance. We have all exaggerated our sense of self, this I, beyond how it actually exists. And from that, all sorts of misery, all sorts of trouble, all sorts of crazy thinking arise. We also get into even more trouble when our concepts about the things that this inherently existent I own, the mine of things in regards to our body, which we see as inherently existent, our loved ones as we see as inherently existent, our stuff, our reputation, everything that we think is owned, inherently existent, owned by this inherently existent I, are the causes for all these afflictive states of mind that arise, which then draw us down into cyclic existence, battered and bruised, falling into lower realms. And so to see that every sentient being is suffering in this way, I am suffering in this way, my dear ones, my sister, my brother, my dearest Dharma friends, the person at the bank, the colleague at work, the white supremacist, the people that are standing on the rooftops in Houston, all are experiencing major dukkha. And that the compassion that sees this and understands this deeply is the first one, compassion observing sentient beings. So what I've been using for the past 2 months, there's 2 ways. There's a 6-point analogy that comes out of those verses of Chandrakirti. It can either be a water wheel where there's buckets attached to a thing that just spins around by the sheer momentum of the water, or a bucket in a well that's attached to what Jeffrey calls a windlass, which has a crank on one side, then a pole with the rope coming through it, and then the bucket's at the end of that rope. And that it's a graphic analogy, at least from my mind, on how we are trapped in cyclic existence due to this self-grasping ignorance that gives rise to afflictions. So I wanted to just go through this analogy because I have found it extremely powerful, because my imagination needs pictures, and although analogies sometimes cannot be used across the board and perfectly, but this one with the bucket in the well trying to describe what dukkha is has been extremely powerful for me to bring my compassion up, not just for myself, but for other beings. So the first analogy is like a bucket tied by a rope to a windlass. Sentient beings are tightly bound to cyclic existence by afflictions and karma. Bound by this rope, the bucket has no freedom. Bound by past actions, we have very little control how cyclic existence unfolds for us. Okay, so there's the first analogy. Bucket on the rope, no control, no way to go anywhere, just like sentient beings under the control of afflictions and karma. Second analogy is just as the windlass moves the bucket, the afflicted mind propels beings into unfortunate rebirths. Now we think we're in control, when in fact the afflictions perpetuate our cyclic existence beyond our control. Like this windlass, it has total control over that bucket, where it's going to go, up and down, up and down. So our minds are like that thing that's cranking up and down, up and down. The third analogy, just as the bucket goes up and down, constantly sentient beings wander up and down. So once again, the analogy, due to the afflictions and karma, we create the causes to have lower rebirths, upper rebirths, lower rebirths, upper rebirths, just like this well goes down, comes up, goes down, come up. Which is a frightening analogy. And depending on what karma is going to ripen at the time of death, that will determine where the consciousness is going to go. So once again, the karma is just ripening. This bucket's going up and down, up and down. The bucket goes down easily but has a heck of a time coming back up. So too, sentient beings create non-virtue very easily, but have a very hard time creating virtue. Easy to drop into the unfortunate realms, very difficult to get ourselves out of them and to sustain some sort of momentum in the higher realms. The fifth analogy is the bucket goes up and down without a break in the cycle. So the 12 links without interruption are created one life after the other, creating the causes for rebirth. We can't hit the pause button. We can't take vacation. This goes on ceaselessly, endlessly. And as we live this life, we are constantly creating more links with negative karma that we are experiencing now. So the 12 links, we're continually creating them as we experience karma in this life. Every time we respond to that karma, virtuous or non-virtue, we're creating a link in that cycle. And the sixth one is the bucket is battered against the sides of the well as it goes down and as it comes up. So even with a fortunate rebirth where we've had all the conducive circumstances that we could possibly have for sharing and living the Dharma and understanding and studying the Dharma and practicing it, in the course of a precious human life, we're still banging against the wall like a bucket. We don't have any day that goes by where there isn't some sort of negative karma ripening, where we're having some sort of physical pain, some sort of dukkha of change, or some all-pervasive conditioned dukkha. So even in the best circumstances, there's no way to escape dukkha. And so it's just like the bucket. It just goes on and on, up it goes. Sometimes it just nudges the walls, and sometimes it just bangs and thrashes all the way down. So that's the sixth of the analogy. So Jeffrey instructs first to imagine our dukkha with this analogy, then your best friend or your loved one, then a lesser enemy, and then the ones that you really have a hard time with. And what I've discovered this summer is that he has said over and over, you have to do these steps step by step. You have to do this analogy first with yourself till you get a real sincere feeling of what dukkha might be, what the experience of it is like in your heart, not just as an intellectual thing. It takes courage to look at the relentless cycle of dukkha like the bucket in the well, and that it's everywhere all day long for everybody without exception. This is something that we really have to understand and recognize, starting with ourselves. Because what happened during the course of a week when Mr. Trump was really, he was just, I can't remember particularly, it was sometime this summer, where I was just astounded and appalled. I couldn't connect with him. I couldn't see his suffering. So I went into the hall and I was working on my sister, putting her through this analogy of the bucket in the well, that she has this dukkha, this endless dukkha. And I inserted him into the practice, and it didn't work. What happened is he. It said, and this is what the way I see Jeffrey's teachings is, if you try to see Mr. Trump's dukkha and you haven't worked your way through everybody else, from yourself to your friend to your stranger to the one that simply annoys you to the one that you really fear that is harming, you're going to actually, as the bucket bangs around in the well, you're going to think of it and enjoy watching it. You know, to see him suffering, to see him confused, to see him struggling with all that he's trying to hold. And to say, serves you right. I saw myself not really caring about the suffering that he was experiencing that day. He was trying to put on a show. It was something around Putin. And I was just like, you get what you deserve. I couldn't put him in that situation. I was happy that he was suffering. And it was like, take him out of the meditation and go back to your sister. You can't see him. You're not there yet. Because if done correctly, the conclusion would be how wonderful it would be for first myself to be free of suffering and its cause, and to feel that and wish that for yourself. And then you go to your friend, you go to your loved one, you go to a stranger. Lesser enemy, greater enemy. You've got because it warms the heart. You get this sense of closeness. And you have to do this like every day for at least 10 minutes. You can't just stop and say, oh, I've got it figured out. I have compassion for a stranger. You've got to just do it until you have a heartfelt experience of this. And I've just barely touched the surface with this. Then there's a second level of aspiration. So then you go to a deeper commitment. You take yourself and you go, may I be free of suffering. So you're not just wishing, you're now getting into the second level of aspirations. May I be free of suffering and its causes. It's more intense, it's got more oomph behind it. And then you take your loved one or your friend, you take the stranger, the lesser enemy, and the great enemy. And then you go yet to the third level of aspiration, which is I will free them from suffering and its causes. I will take on the responsibility of freeing each and every living being. And although we can't do it, actually, it makes our minds very strong that if we were to have to do it, we could. So this is what this whole book is about. And then you get to chapter 13, it's like, you're not done yet. This is now you're ready to start thinking about how to generate compassion. Jeffrey says that progressing with this attitude of working through this analogy day after day, using these different people in the world, endows us with fortitude, endurance, and determination. And something that I can attest to is that he says the threshold of anger moves farther and farther away. So I can actually say in this past week, after Mr. Trump, I don't call him president right now, Mr. Trump pardoned the sheriff, which I found just appalling. I was able to not be so angry. I was like, oh, he's trying to be happy. My God, he's trying to be happy. It was the sadness that came in my heart that he's doing these things that are creating the causes for such incredible suffering from himself. And what Jeffrey says that over time, to increase our confidence, that dramatic changes can occur. So I can see that there's been this slight shift in my capacity to not go to that furiousness, to that rage, to the absolutely deploring. I can see that I'm holding and pulling a little bit, keeping my heart open a little bit in the situation. And Jeffrey says, one contemplation at a time, and each one is an opening to a new orientation. So for me, it's easier to do with the flood victims. India, Houston, Donegal, Ireland, Ontario, Oregon. There's 12 or 13 places in the world right now that are flooding. The folks in Charlottesville. It's a whole lot harder for me to do with Mr. Trump and the white supremacists and the fake news folks, to not hate them, but to see them as human beings, tragically confused, and creating a horrendous and lonely journey now each day and in the future to be in that well, bashing side to side into a lower realm. That's like, I'm like crying. Anyway, may they be free of suffering.